The wagon hit the rut hard enough to crack Maeve Hollis's back tooth against her own jaw. She didn't cry out. She pressed 2 fingers to her cheek, tasted iron, and watched the driver, a stocky man named Dell, who had not once looked her in the eyes since picking her up from the Harwick depot, fight the reins back under control as the wheels found solid ground again. "Sorry," he muttered. He didn't mean it. Maeve said nothing. She pulled her shawl tighter and looked out past the gray canvas flap at the land rolling by. It was the kind of landscape that didn't apologize for itself. Wide and flat and brown in the way that things get brown when they've given up. Scrub grass, fence posts tilted at wrong angles, their wire long since gone. Sky the color of old pewter pressing down on everything like a lid. 3 weeks she'd been traveling. 3 weeks since she'd left the Widow Hatch's boarding house in Callaway with her single trunk, her letter of employment, and the kind of careful hope that she'd learned at 41 years old to keep very quiet inside herself, like a candle in a wind. She had read the advertisement so many times the paper had gone soft along its folds. Wanted. Capable woman for frontier household management. Keene Ranch, Dunmore Territory. Must be hardy, willing, and of steady character. References required. Compensation negotiable. There had been no mention of children in the advertisement. She'd found out about the children from the agency clerk in Harwick, a thin man who said it like an afterthought. 2 of them, both young, boy and a girl, while already looking past her shoulder at the next woman in line. She had taken the position anyway. The wagon crested a shallow rise and Dell pulled back on the reins without being asked. "There," he said. Maeve leaned forward. The Keene Ranch sat low in a wide bowl of land maybe half a mile ahead. She could see the main house, 2 stories, once painted white, the paint now peeled back to bare gray wood in long strips, like something shedding skin. A barn behind it with one hinge side of the main door hanging free, swinging slow in the cold wind. A smoke-stained outbuilding. A paddock with 3 horses standing close together for warmth. And beyond all of it, just open country, no neighbors. No trees worth speaking of, nothing but distance in every direction. "Looks empty," she said. "It ain't," Dell said. He snapped the reins. The man who came to meet the wagon was not what she'd expected. She didn't know exactly what she had expected. The advertisement had said nothing about the ranch owner personally, and she'd built no particular picture of him. But she had expected someone who came to meet a hired woman with at least the basic courtesy that one human being extends to another. Rowan Keene came across the yard with his hands in his coat pockets and his jaw set and his eyes moving over her the way a man evaluates a piece of equipment he suspects is already broken. He was tall, lean in the way that comes not from health, but from a body burning through its own reserves, dark hair unwashed and pushed back from his face, a beard that had not been trimmed in weeks. His coat was good quality, or had been once, but it was missing 2 buttons, and the collar was fraying. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, she guessed, though something about the set of his eyes made him look older. He stopped a few feet from the wagon, looked at her, said nothing. Dell climbed down, unstrapped her trunk, and set it in the mud without ceremony. "She's all yours, Keene. Sign here." Rowan didn't move toward the paper. He was still looking at Maeve. She climbed down herself, not waiting for a hand that wasn't going to be offered. Her boots hit the mud and she straightened her skirt and met his eyes. "Mr. Keene," she said, "I'm Maeve Hollis. The agency sent me from Harwick." "I can see who you are," he said. His voice was low. Not unkind exactly, but flattened, the way voices get when a person has stopped caring much about the impression they make. He turned to Dell. "This is what they sent?" Dell shifted his weight and looked at the ground. "I'm standing right here," Maeve said. Rowan looked back at her. His eyes moved from her face to her hands. She knew what he saw. 41 years of living. Hands that showed it. Crow's feet at her eyes. A woman who had not been young in a while and wasn't trying to pretend otherwise. "The letter said capable," he said. "I am capable. I asked for someone younger. I asked for someone with farm experience." His jaw moved. "You've worked in houses, boarding houses," the letter said. "I have, and farms before that. And before that, things I won't bore you with." She held his gaze. "The letter also said you need help. I need strong help." He said it without cruelty, which almost made it worse. He was just stating a fact, or what he believed was a fact, the way you'd state that the fence needs a new post. I've got livestock that needs physical management, a house falling to pieces, and 2 children who need more than... He stopped himself. More than what? She said. He didn't finish it. He turned back to Dell and signed the paper, and Maeve understood that she had just been discussed and evaluated and found wanting, all in the space of 2 minutes, by a man who hadn't yet asked her a single question. Dell climbed back onto the wagon. He looked at Maeve briefly, something almost apologetic in his expression. Then he was gone, the wheels cutting back through the mud toward the road. Rowan Keene looked at her trunk, then at the house, then at some middle distance that seemed to contain the actual conversation he was having in his own head. Then he said, flatly, "I'll send a letter to the agency. I don't think this is going to work." "You can send whatever letter you like," Maeve said. "But I've been traveling for 3 weeks, and it'll be dark in 2 hours, and I'm not standing in your yard while you sort out your correspondence." She picked up one end of her trunk. "Which room?" He stared at her. "Which room, Mr. Keene?" The house smelled like cold ash and something slightly sour that she couldn't immediately place. She placed it when she got to the kitchen. The pot on the stove had been sitting long enough that the layer of congealed something at the bottom had gone gray. There were dishes stacked unevenly near the basin, not washed, not fully dirty, left in that limbo that happens when nobody has the energy to do either. The floor near the wood stove was tracked with mud that had dried and been walked over again until it was a fine, gritty powder. The curtains, she noticed them because they were pretty, a faded yellow, clearly chosen by someone with an eye for small pleasures, had not been opened in a while. The light in the room was dim and low and had the quality of a place where people go to wait rather than to live. She stood in the kitchen doorway with her coat still on and took it in. A girl of about 8 was sitting at the kitchen table. She was small and dark-haired, and she was looking at Maeve with the careful, measuring look that children develop when they have gotten used to disappointment. She had a piece of string in her hands that she'd been making into some kind of pattern. She'd stopped when Maeve walked in. "Hello," Maeve said. "Hello," the girl said. "I'm Maeve." The girl nodded. "I'm Clara." She glanced toward the hallway, then back. "Papa said you were coming, and then he said you probably weren't staying." "He said that, did he?" "He says that about most things." Clara looked down at her string. "He said it about the chickens, too, and we still have the chickens." Maeve pressed her lips together to keep the expression off her face. "Where's your brother? Barn. He sleeps out there sometimes." Clara said it without any notable distress, which meant it had become normal, which meant it shouldn't have. "How old is he?" 11. "He thinks he's older." Maeve set her coat on the back of a chair and moved to the stove. She lifted the lid off the gray pot and looked inside and put the lid back down. "When did you last eat?" Clara tilted her head, thinking. "This morning. Papa made porridge." "Good porridge?" Clara picked up her string again. "It had lumps." Maeve found the pantry door at the far side of the kitchen. She opened it and stood for a moment looking at the shelves. There was flour, a near-empty sack, a tin of lard, some dried beans, half a sack of cornmeal, a few onions going soft, a heel of cured meat, hard as a boot. The kind of provisions that told a story about a household coasting toward empty. She heard boots on the back steps, and then the back door opened and a boy came in. He was all sharp angles, elbows and knees and cheekbones, and he had his father's coloring and the wary eyes of a child who has learned to read rooms before entering them. He took one look at Maeve and stopped. "You're the woman," he said. "Eli," Clara said, in the tone of a younger sibling who has already decided to like someone. "That's me," Maeve said. "You must be Eli." He said nothing. He was assessing her clearly, and not trying to hide it. She could see him cataloging what he saw the same way his father had, but without his father's hardness, more like someone who has been hurt enough to need to know what's coming. "Papa says you're leaving," he said. "Your father says a lot of things." Maeve turned back to the pantry. "Are you hungry?" Silence. She looked over her shoulder. Both children were watching her. "I'm going to take that as yes," she said. "Come sit down." She made corn cakes because she had cornmeal and lard and a cast iron pan that, once she'd scraped off the layer of old grease, was perfectly good. She found a small bit of cured meat in the heel and cut it thin and crisped it in the pan first. The children sat at the table and watched her work. "You don't talk much," Clara said. "I talk when there's something to say." Maeve tilted the pan to spread the fat. "Papa doesn't talk much either." He used to," Eli said from the other end of the table. He said it in the offhand way of someone trying to seem like they don't care about the thing they're saying. "Before Ma died," Maeve kept her eyes on the pan. "I'm sorry about your mother." Neither child said anything. She poured the batter. The kitchen filled with the smell of something cooking, which was different from the smell of cold ash, and she heard Clara make a small sound at the table that she pretended was just shifting in her chair. Rowan came in while she was plating the second batch. He stopped in the kitchen doorway the same way his son had, though with less honesty about it. He arranged his face into something neutral and stood with his arms crossed. He looked at the pan, then at the plates she'd set on the table, then at his children sitting there eating. Clara had a corn cake in both hands and a smear of lard at the corner of her mouth, and she was looking at it with a concentration that hurt to see. Rowan said nothing. He looked at Maeve. She didn't offer him a plate. She turned back to the stove and started on a third batch. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "They were hungry. I would have fed them." "When?" The word landed flat and plain. She hadn't sharpened it. She was just asking, but he heard the edge in it anyway. He came into the kitchen and pulled out a chair and sat. And for a while there was just the sound of the fire and the children eating and the pan doing what pans do. She set a plate in front of him without comment. He looked at it for a moment. Then he picked up his fork. He tried to send the letter the next morning. She knew he was trying because she heard him at the writing table in the front room, the scratch of a pen, long pauses. She was in the kitchen starting the morning fire. The children were still asleep. After a while, the scratching stopped. She heard him get up, heard the front door open and close. She looked out the kitchen window and watched him cross the yard to the barn in the gray early light, hands in his pockets, head down, the way a man walks when he's arguing with himself. He didn't finish the letter that day, or the next. She did not make herself agreeable. She wasn't sure she knew how to, particularly, and in any case, that wasn't what the situation required. What the situation required was work, and she did it. The kitchen first, because that was the heart of the house, and it was failing. She scrubbed the pot and the dishes and the floor, and got the curtains down and beat them outside until the dust came off in clouds. She reorganized the pantry so she could see exactly what they had. She made a list of what they needed. The list was sobering. She brought it to Rowan on the third day. He was in the barn mending a piece of harness, and he looked up when she came in with the expression of a man who has accepted that someone is living in his house and is still not entirely sure how it happened. "This is what you're short on," she said, and handed him the paper. He read it. His jaw worked. "Do you have an account at the Dunmore store?" she asked. "I have an account I'm behind on." He handed the paper back. "There's not money to fill all that." "I know. I've marked what's essential with an X." She took the paper back. "The rest I can manage around until you're better situated." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, but close to it. "You didn't add anything for yourself," he said. "What?" "The list." He nodded at the paper. "There's nothing on there for you. Women usually want, the last..." He stopped. "The last woman," Maeve said. He looked away. She wasn't right for the ranch. "How many have there been? Since Martha died?" He put the harness down and rubbed the back of his neck. 3. 2 didn't last past a week. 1 lasted almost a month. "What happened to the third one?" "Town." He said it without expression. She wanted to be closer to town. Maeve folded the list and put it in her pocket. "I don't need to be close to town." He picked up the harness again. "You say that now." She looked around the barn. The horses she'd already begun to assess. They were underfed, but not badly so. They just needed consistency. The feed situation she could see needed attention. There was a crack running up the east wall that would let in cold when the real winter came. She noted it and didn't say anything about it yet. "Rowan," she said. He looked up, faintly startled that she'd used his first name. "I'm not asking you to like that I'm here," she said. "I'm asking you to work with what you've got." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back down at the harness. "Get the list to Denny Marsh at the store," he said. "Tell him I sent you." The town of Dunmore was 6 miles down a road that didn't deserve the name. Maeve drove herself in the small wagon, having established that Eli could show her which horse to hitch, and that the horse's name was Fig, and that Fig was mostly cooperative if you didn't rush her. Eli had given her these instructions with great seriousness, which she received with equal seriousness, because he was clearly someone who needed his knowledge to be taken seriously. The town was small. 24 buildings, most of them wooden, one street that turned to paste in the rain, a church, a livery, a barber, a general store with Marsh's goods painted in fading letters above the door. She went to the store. Denny Marsh was a round-faced man of about 60, with wire spectacles and the permanently skeptical expression of a merchant who has extended too much credit to too many people. He looked at her list, and then at her, and then at the list again. "You're Keene's new woman," he said. "I'm working at the Keene Ranch," Maeve said. "He said you'd know the account." "I know the account," Denny Marsh said, in the tone of a man who knows an account very well. "He's 3 months behind." "I understand." "I don't usually extend further credit to accounts that are—" "I understand," Maeve said again. "He knows it too. He's asking as a courtesy, not as a right. If it helps, I can tell you that there are 2 children out there who are short on basics, and that the ranch is workable if it's properly managed, which I intend to do." Denny Marsh looked at her over his spectacles. "You the 4th one?" he asked. "I don't know what number I am." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he put on his counter and began reading through the list properly, moving his lips slightly. "I can do the flour and the cornmeal," he said. "Salt pork, the dried beans, lard." He tapped the paper with his finger. "The rest he'll need to settle up before I can move on it." "That's fair," she said. "Thank you." She was loading the wagon when she heard the women. There were 2 of them on the sidewalk in front of the barber shop, neither making any particular effort to be quiet. One of them was fair-haired and sharp-faced, maybe 35. The other was older and wore a hat with a dyed feather that had seen better days. "That's her," the fair-haired one said, not quietly. Maeve kept loading. "4th one," the feathered hat said. "Did you hear what happened to the Prentice girl? Lasted 8 days. Cold in those children, the boy especially." The fair-haired one clucked her tongue. "Poor thing, whoever she is. Keene won't let anyone in, not really. She'll be on the wagon back to Harwick by Christmas. Mark it." Maeve picked up the last sack and set it in the wagon. She turned and looked at the 2 women directly. Neither of them looked away. The fair-haired one had the slight pink of someone who has been overheard and doesn't care. "Thank you for the encouragement," Maeve said. She climbed up onto the wagon bench, clicked her tongue at Fig, and pointed them back toward the ranch. On her 11th day at the Keene Ranch, she found Rowan sitting on the floor of the barn at 2 a.m. She had gotten up to use the outhouse and seen the lamplight under the barn door. Not sure what to make of it, she crossed the yard. She found him sitting with his back against the stall where the roan mare stood, his knees drawn up and a bottle between them that was mostly empty. He was not asleep. He was looking at nothing in particular, with the look of a man who has gone somewhere inside himself that isn't a good place to be. He saw her and said nothing. She was in her night clothes with her coat thrown over them, her hair down, mud on her boots from the path. She probably didn't look like much. She was also 41 years old and past the age of being embarrassed about how she looked at 2 a.m. She came in and sat on a nearby hay bale. The roan shifted and blew warm breath into the cold air. "You should be asleep," he said. His voice was thicker than usual, not quite drunk, but further from sober than he'd been at dinner. "So should you," she said. Silence. The wind moved against the barn walls. Somewhere out in the dark an animal called, something small and far away. "Martha died in October," he said. Not to her exactly, just to the air. 8 months ago. Fever, it came on fast. He moved the bottle between his hands. Fast enough that I was still... He stopped. "I was in the east pasture when she went, 200 yards away." He shook his head. "Clara found her." Maeve said nothing. 8 years old and she found her mother. His voice didn't break. It did something worse. It stayed completely level. The way a voice goes when a person has practiced not breaking for so long that the muscle is just gone. "I keep thinking I should have..." He stopped. "It doesn't matter. It matters, Maeve said quietly. It's just that thinking you should have done something different usually isn't about what you should have done. It's about not being able to stand that you couldn't stop it. He looked at her then, really looked at her, for the first time since she'd arrived, not assessing her worth or looking past her to some point of irritation, but actually looking at her, like she was a person who'd just said something that landed somewhere real. You've lost someone, he said. She looked at the mare's legs, the fine lines of the fetlock. Yes. He didn't ask who. She didn't tell him. That was its own kind of courtesy. After a while, he said, I asked for someone younger because I thought that's what the children needed. Energy. Someone who could... He closed his eyes briefly. I was wrong about that. Maybe, she said. Not maybe. He set the bottle aside. Clara asked me this morning if you were staying. I didn't know what to tell her. Maeve stood up from the hay bale. Her joints protested. She was 41 and had been working hard, and the cold got into things it hadn't used to get into. Tell her I'm here, she said. That's all she needs to know right now. She left him there in the lamplight and walked back across the dark yard to the house. Her hands were cold by the time she got inside. She stood at the kitchen window for a moment and could see the stripe of light under the barn door. After a while, it went out. She went back to bed. She lay in the dark room that had been a spare room and was now her room, listening to the wind come across the flat land and push at the walls. And she thought about what it takes to stay somewhere you haven't been wanted. She'd stayed in harder places, she decided. She closed her eyes. End of part 1. The morning after she found Rowan in the barn, neither of them mentioned it. That was a kind of agreement, she supposed. The unspoken kind that people fall into when they've seen something true about each other and aren't ready to do anything with it yet. He came in for breakfast looking like a man who had slept badly on a barn floor, which he had, and she put coffee in front of him without comment, and he drank it without comment, and the children ate their porridge, better porridge than before, with less lumps, because she'd learned the stove's temper by now, and the morning moved on the way mornings do when people are still figuring out how to share a space. What changed, though, was small but real. He stopped looking past her when she spoke. Not much, maybe just a degree or two, but she noticed it the way you notice when a draft stops coming through a crack. Not dramatic, just the absence of something cold. She didn't make anything of it. She had work to do. The livestock situation was worse than it had first appeared, and it had first appeared bad. The 3 horses were manageable. Fig the wagon mare, the roan she'd seen Rowan with in the barn, and a young gelding that Eli had named Copper for reasons that made sense only to Eli. But there were also 8 chickens in a state of profound disorganization, a milk cow named Pearl who had developed the habit of kicking at her milking stanchion with her left rear leg at irregular intervals, and 2 hogs in a pen behind the barn whose feed situation had been handled with the kind of optimism that substitutes intention for actual provision. She asked Eli about the hogs the second week. He was in the barn with her, which had become a thing that happened in the mornings now, without anyone deciding it would. He just started showing up while she did the feeding, at first pretending he was there for other reasons, checking on Copper or looking for a tool he'd left. She didn't call attention to it. The hogs, she said. Who's been feeding them? I have, Eli said, from behind Copper's stall. When I remember. When you remember, she repeated. Papa used to do it. Then he stopped for a while. A pause. Then I started. She looked at the hog pen through the barn's side door. The 2 animals were rooting at ground that had given up everything it had to give weeks ago. What are you feeding them? Scraps, whatever's left. There haven't been many scraps, she said. Silence. She could hear him moving straw around in Copper's stall, something to do with his hands. I know, he said. She didn't press it. She just added the hogs to the list she kept in her head, the list that never quite stopped growing, the list of things that had been sliding for 8 months while a man sat on barn floors in the dark, and 2 children did their best to hold things together with 11-year-old hands and 8-year-old ones. That afternoon, she cooked down the scraps from lunch with some extra cornmeal and carried the bucket out herself. The hogs came at her in their blundering, enthusiastic way, and she stood back and let them eat and thought about ratios and how long the cornmeal would last and what else she could supplement it with. Eli appeared at the fence post beside her. He hadn't been following her. He'd just materialized there the way he did. You don't have to do that, he said. I know I don't. He watched the hogs eat. The late afternoon light came across the flat ground at a low angle and made everything look briefly warmer than it was. Mrs. Latimer, he said. She was the third one, the one who went to town. He said it neutrally, informational. She said the hogs smelled bad. They do smell bad, Maeve said. That's hogs. The corner of Eli's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. She carried the empty bucket back to the barn. The thing about children who've been through something hard is that they don't need you to fix everything at once. They need to see that you keep showing up, that when you say you'll be somewhere, you're there, that the bucket gets filled and carried out, and the hogs get fed, and tomorrow it happens again. Predictability is a form of safety when safety has been missing for a while. She'd learned that not from any book, but from watching it, from being the person who stayed, and from watching what it did to the people she stayed for. She wasn't thinking about any of that consciously as she hung the bucket back on its hook. She was just doing what needed doing. But somewhere in the back of things, she understood why it mattered. Rowan saw her coming back across the yard and paused at the fence he'd been mending. He watched her for a moment with that measuring look that had become slightly less measuring over the past 2 weeks and slightly more like just looking. Hogs are fed, she said as she passed. I saw, he said. She kept walking. He went back to the fence. That was how it was between them. Functional, careful. Moving around each other with the particular awareness of two people who have chosen, without quite saying so, not to crowd each other. It suited her. She wasn't here for anything that needed rushing. What she was here for became clear every day, and it was larger than she'd initially understood. Because the problem at the Keene Ranch wasn't just the empty pantry or the neglected livestock or the peeling paint. The problem was that grief had moved into the house like a fourth resident, and nobody had figured out how to make it pay for its keep or how to put it out. It was in the silences at the dinner table. It was in the way Rowan sometimes stopped in the middle of a task and just stood, not doing anything, for 20 or 30 seconds before coming back to himself. It was in the way Clara kept her mother's yellow curtains, even after Maeve took them down to beat the dust out of them. The girl had watched those curtains go out the door with an expression that Maeve caught and understood and made sure to put them back up that same evening, cleaner but recognizably themselves. Grief in a house changes the way a house works. It makes people quiet when they should speak, and makes them stay up when they should sleep, and makes them forget to feed the hogs. Maeve couldn't fix that. She wasn't trying to, but she could build a different kind of structure alongside it, something routine and warm and consistent, and let that do what time and steadiness eventually do. She started with meals. Not because food solves anything, but because a meal is a reason to sit down together, and sitting down together is a reason to be in the same room. And being in the same room is how people remember that they are not, in fact, entirely alone. The first few dinners had been quiet to the point of strangeness. Rowan ate efficiently, like a man fueling equipment. Eli watched his plate. Clara talked sometimes, in her particular way, small observations about things she'd seen during the day, not quite conversation, more like signals that she was still there, still paying attention to the world. Maeve talked back to Clara. She asked questions. She listened to the answers in a way that made it clear she was listening and not just waiting for her turn. It took about a week before Eli started adding to things Clara said. Small additions, corrections, the way older siblings can't help themselves. It took another few days after that before Rowan started listening to the children with something other than distant attention, actually hearing what they were saying, reacting to it, occasionally adding something himself. The meals got louder, not much, but measurably. There was one night, maybe 18 days in, when Clara said something about one of the chickens, a banty she'd named Periwinkle, which was apparently the one that stood at the kitchen window sometimes and seemed to be trying to look in. And Eli said with great authority that chickens didn't actually see windows as glass. They just saw their own reflection. And Clara said that wasn't true. And how would he know? And they went back and forth about it with increasing animation while Maeve watched and kept her expression neutral. And Rowan laughed. It was short, almost surprise-sounding, like a man who'd startled himself with his own reaction. He put his hand over his mouth quickly, as if it had been an accident. But he'd laughed, and the children had both turned to look at him, and Clara had grinned a grin that went all the way up to her eyes, And even Eli had looked satisfied in the private way that older children look satisfied when a parent comes back to them from somewhere far away. Rowan caught Maeve looking at him, and the openness in his face closed back up. Not all the way, but enough to be perceptible. He picked up his fork. "Chickens can see glass," he said, without looking at anyone. But Eli's point about the reflection isn't wrong. Eli nodded with great seriousness, and Clara disputed it further, and the meal went on. Maeve ate her beans and said nothing. The pantry was the ongoing problem. The supplies from Denny Marsh had helped, but they were burning through flour faster than she'd estimated because she was making actual meals now rather than the minimal effort stopgap that had apparently been passing for cooking before she arrived. She had found, in her second week, that the previous management of the kitchen had relied heavily on whatever required the least effort. A lot of boiled things, a lot of porridge, a lot of dried meat not properly prepared. Not bad intentions, just exhaustion making the decisions. She was better with what she had than that, but better still required having it. She went to Rowan on a Thursday morning when the children were occupied. Clara with her lessons, which Maeve had reinstated with the discovery of a box of school books in the front room that nobody had opened since October, and Eli with a fence repair that Rowan had given him to do, partly for the work and partly, she suspected, because Rowan was slowly, reluctantly, remembering that the boy needed tasks. Rowan was at the table with the ranch ledger open in front of him, frowning at it. She sat down across from him with her own piece of paper. He looked up. "Flower situation," she said. "I know," he said. "I need to know what we actually have coming in this month and what's owed." She set her paper on the table. "I'm not asking to manage your books. I just need to know what I have to work with." He looked at the ledger and then at her. There was the brief flicker of something defensive in his eyes. She recognized it. The look of a man who's used to being the one who handles things, who sees someone asking about the books as a judgment on how he's handled things. She waited it out. He turned the ledger toward her. The numbers were not good. She already knew they weren't good. You couldn't look at this ranch for 2 weeks and not understand that. But seeing it written down gave it a different weight. 3 months behind with Marsh. A note coming due in spring on a loan he'd taken out the previous year for a piece of equipment she'd seen rusting in the far corner of the barn. Income from the cattle dependent on a spring sale that was still months away. "You have cattle," she said. 14 head. They're out in the east pasture. I haven't seen them. They don't need much in fall. The grass is still holding." He rubbed the back of his neck. "In a normal year, I'd have sold some in September. I didn't make the market." She looked at him. "I didn't make a lot of things in September," he said quietly. She didn't respond to that directly. She pulled the ledger a little closer and looked at the figures again. "Marsh said he'd extend on the essential supplies if the account moves. If you sent him even a partial payment, I know what Marsh needs," he said. He said it without sharpness, just a man who knows his own situation. "I'm not doubting that." She pushed the ledger back. "Is there anything else? Anything I haven't seen?" He was quiet for a moment. "There's a stand of timber on the north edge of the property. Been meaning to have it logged for 2 years. A man named Vance in Dunmore buys timber rights. It wouldn't be a lot of money, but it'd be something. Is the timber worth more than the note coming due?" He looked at her steadily. "You ask direct questions. It's faster." A beat. "Yes," he said. "If Vance gives me a fair price." "Then go see Vance," she said. She got up from the table, took her piece of paper back, and went to the kitchen. She heard him sit there for another few minutes. She could feel it, the weight of him in that chair doing the private arithmetic that people do when someone has just said the obvious thing they've been avoiding. Then she heard the scrape of the chair and his boots on the floor and the front door. He went to see Vance the following Monday. He came back with a price that wasn't quite fair, but was close enough. He stopped at Marsh's on the way home and made a partial payment on the account. He didn't announce any of this at dinner. He just came in and hung up his coat and sat down and ate. And she noticed that he sat a little differently. Not easier, exactly, but less like a man bracing for something. Clara noticed too, in the way children notice things before they have words for what they're noticing. She ate more of her dinner than usual and told him about Periwinkle's activities in excessive detail, and he listened to all of it. It was the last week of October when the real cold came. It didn't ease in. It arrived the way weather arrives in that part of the country. One morning, the temperature dropped 20 degrees between dawn and mid-morning, and the wind shifted to come from the northwest, and it had ice in it. The sky went the color of a dirty sheet and stayed that way. The ground froze into ridges and ruts. The horses grew their winter coats overnight, it seemed, and stood in the barn with steam coming off their backs. Maeve put extra blankets on the children's beds. She checked the kitchen stovepipe and found a crack she didn't like. Not catastrophic yet, but worth watching. She showed it to Rowan. He looked at it and said he'd take care of it. She believed he intended to. He had a lot of things to take care of, and she was learning that he managed the ranch the way a man manages things when he's working slightly below the capacity he needs, getting the urgent things done and letting the merely important ones drift. She'd seen it before. It wasn't laziness. It was the mathematics of not having enough hours. She noted the stovepipe and put it on her own list and watched it. On the 28th day she was at the ranch, she went into Dunmore again for supplies. She went alone, as she always did. She was hitching Fig to the wagon in the yard when she heard steps behind her and turned to find Eli standing there with his hands in his pockets. "I could come," he said. She looked at him. He was trying very hard to look like he didn't care either way. "You could," she said. "Can you handle Fig's offside buckle? She's fussy about it." He came forward and did the buckle with the ease of a boy who'd been doing it since he was small. She climbed up onto the bench. He climbed up beside her. They drove the 6 miles to Dunmore in the cold, mostly without speaking, which was fine. Fig moved at her usual pace, unhurried. The frozen ground made the going smoother than the mud had, though colder. About halfway there, Eli said, "The last woman, Mrs. Latimer. She used to make Dunmore runs." "Did she?" "She'd be gone half the day." He was looking at the road ahead. "Clara didn't mind, but I thought she might not come back. Some of the time." Maeve kept her eyes on the road, too. "That happened? Someone who didn't come back?" "First one, before the second one." He shrugged. "She just didn't come back from town one day. Her things were still in the house." Maeve let that sit for a moment. Then she said, "When I go to town, I come back." He didn't say anything. "I'm not saying it to make you feel better," she said. "I'm saying it because it's true. You can hold me to it." He was quiet for another mile. Then, "Clara likes you." "I like Clara." "She didn't like Mrs. Latimer." "Smart girl, Clara." Eli made a sound that was definitely a laugh, even if he swallowed it quickly. He looked out the other side of the wagon, and she let him have that. In Dunmore, the woman with the feathered hat was coming out of the general store as Maeve came in. The woman stopped and looked at her. At Eli standing behind her, at the list in her hand, at the fact of her, still here, still buying supplies, still returning from wherever she'd come from each time she left. "Still at it," the woman said. Not unkindly exactly, more like surprised. "Still at it," Maeve confirmed and went inside. Denny Marsh had heard about the partial payment, and his manner was different. Not warm, he probably wasn't a warm man, but the skepticism had shifted down a notch. He filled the order without comment except for practical ones. He threw in a small tin of molasses that wasn't on the list. "For the children," he said, without looking up. "Thank you, Mr. Marsh," she said. Eli carried the heavier sacks to the wagon without being asked. She noted it and didn't make a thing of it. On the drive back, with the wagon loaded and Fig leaning into the cold wind coming from the northwest, Eli said, abruptly and without preamble, "Papa was different before. Not just sad. Different." He paused. "He used to talk more. He used to... There was a summer a couple years ago, he and Ma put up a whole new fence line on the south pasture in 1 week, both of them working it together. He'd come in for lunch and he'd be..." He stopped and searched for the word. "Loud. He'd come in loud. Jokes and things." Maeve listened. "I just wanted you to know," Eli said, "that he wasn't always like this." He said it with the careful dignity of a son defending his father to someone who might have formed a final judgment. "I know he wasn't," Maeve said. "You couldn't know that. You didn't know him before." "No," she said, "but I can see the shape of it. The shape of what he was, even through the shape of what he is now." She kept her eyes on the road. The people who get quietest when they're hurting are usually the ones who were loudest when they were all right. Eli thought about that for a while. "He came in for breakfast on time every morning this week," he said eventually. I noticed, Maeve said. They drove the rest of the way home in silence that wasn't empty. She had never needed her silences to be filled. She'd learned, a long time ago, that silence is only uncomfortable when people don't trust each other enough to be in it. When the trust was there, even the beginning of it, even the tentative, unsteady beginning, silence was just space. Room for things to settle. The ranch came into view over the rise, the gray house, the barn, the smoke coming from the kitchen chimney that she'd started before she left. Eli saw it, and she felt him straighten slightly beside her. She felt it too. That small thing, smoke from a chimney, a house with someone in it, a light in the window that meant something was waiting for you. Not everything, not fixed, not fine. But there. She clicked her tongue at Fig, and the mare picked up her pace without being asked, heading for home. November came in hard and didn't apologize for it. The temperature dropped to the kind of cold that makes the air feel thin, like the warmth has been wrung out of it entirely, and what's left is just the skeleton of weather. The ground was iron. The water trough in the yard developed a crust of ice each night that had to be broken each morning, and the mornings came later and darker, and with a wind off the northwestern plain that hit the side of the house like it was looking for a way in. Maeve woke earlier. She had to, because the kitchen fire needed to be going before the children got up, or the room would be cold enough to see your breath, and a cold kitchen in the morning sets a particular kind of misery into a day that takes hours to shake. She'd learned this the hard way the first week, and she'd adjusted, and now she was up at 5:15 every morning, moving quietly through the dark house, building the fire back from its nighttime coals, putting the coffee on, listening to the wind push at the walls, and the particular creak the third stair made when the temperature changed. She'd come to know this house the way you come to know any place you tend, through its sounds and its failures, through what it did in rain versus dry, through where the draft came in and where the floor went soft and which window latch needed to be lifted and turned at exactly the same moment or it wouldn't catch. She knew it the way the previous occupant must have known it, the woman whose yellow curtains still hung in the kitchen, whose handwriting she'd found on the inside of a pantry shelf. A list of measurements, flour and sugar and salt, written in a neat, slanting hand that told you something about the woman, even if you'd never met her. Martha Keene had known this house. Maeve was learning it second. There was no strangeness in that for her. She had always been good at inheriting other people's spaces, at moving into the shape left behind without trying to erase it. It was something she'd done often enough that it had stopped feeling like anything other than practical. What was less practical, what she thought about on the dark mornings while the kitchen came back to life, was the stovepipe. She'd shown it to Rowan in the last week of October. He'd looked at it, said he'd handle it, and then the timber business and the marsh payment and a heifer that had gotten a leg caught in a fence and needed attention had all pushed in ahead of it. And here they were into November with the stove running hot every day, and the crack she'd identified still sitting there in the pipe's second joint, waiting. She looked at it most mornings. She'd taken to opening the kitchen door and cracking the window slightly when the stove was running hard, just to keep the air moving. Rowan had noticed this and mentioned that it defeated the purpose of the fire. She told him there was a reason for it. He'd accepted this without asking what the reason was, which was its own kind of progress. 2 months ago, he'd have dismissed the whole thing. She kept watching the pipe. The first real tension came in the second week of November, and it didn't come from where she'd expected. It came from Eli. She had, over the course of their almost 2 months together, developed a decent understanding of Eli Keene. He was 11 and smart and carrying more than an 11-year-old should and managing it by staying useful, by being the person who knew where things were and how things worked and what the horses needed and how to read the weather off the cloud formations to the west. He had filled the space left by his father's retreat in the particular way that oldest children do, taking on the quiet authority of the household because somebody had to, handing it back gradually as Rowan came back to himself, but not without some friction. The friction came on a Tuesday. Rowan had decided, that week, to start Eli on some basic figures. Not formal schooling. He was pragmatic about what the ranch required versus what they had time for, but the kind of practical arithmetic a boy running a working property needed. The ledger, how to read it, how to calculate feed ratios, and the cost per head of keeping cattle through winter. Eli had sat down at the table for this lesson with the careful blankness of a person who is preparing to be disappointed. Maeve was in the kitchen, but the rooms weren't far enough apart that she couldn't hear. You're holding the pen wrong, Rowan said. I'm not. Your grip's too tight, like this. A pause, presumably demonstration. I know how to hold a pen. Then write it the way I showed you. Silence. Then, I've been doing the feed calculations myself all fall. Ask Maeve, she'll tell you. I know you have. Rowan's voice was measured, not unkind, but carrying the particular edge of a father who is trying to teach and is being resisted. That's why I'm showing you the proper way to record it. There's nothing wrong with how I record it. Eli, you weren't here, Eli said. Not loud, not dramatic, just flat and hard and true. The way 11-year-old boys say the thing they've been holding for a long time when they finally run out of room to hold it. All fall. You weren't here. I did the feed and the water, and I kept the horses, and I kept track of what we had, and I did it without anybody showing me anything. And now you want to tell me I'm holding the pen wrong. Maeve put her dish down without making noise. Silence from the front room. A long one. You're right, Rowan said finally. She heard Eli shift in his chair. You did all of that, Rowan said. And I wasn't here the way I should have been. That's true. His voice had changed, the teaching tone gone, something more careful and less armored in its place. I'm not trying to tell you it wasn't enough. I want to be the one who shows you things now, while I still can. Is that all right? Another silence. Shorter. My grip isn't wrong, Eli said. Your grip is fine, Rowan said. I was wrong about the grip. Maeve picked her dish back up and went on with what she was doing. She didn't know if that constituted a breakthrough. It probably didn't, not in any clean or resolved way. But it was something. A father and a son finding the edge of a wound and touching it without either of them walking away. And that was worth something even when it was clumsy. She made extra biscuits that evening without explanation. Eli ate 4 of them, which told her something about how much the afternoon had cost him, even if he wouldn't have said so. The second piece of tension came from outside the ranch entirely. There was a man named Gerald Pratt, who owned the parcel immediately east of the Keene property. Maeve had heard him mentioned twice in passing, once by Denny Marsh in what seemed like a careful, neutral way that suggested a history of not-so-neutral events, and once by Rowan himself in the flat, uninflected tone he used for things he'd decided not to think about more than necessary. Pratt came to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon while Rowan was out checking on the cattle in the east pasture. Maeve was in the yard splitting kindling. She'd started doing this because the supply was running low, and she was tired of waiting for it to refill itself. When a horse and rider came up the track and stopped at the yard gate, Pratt was maybe 50, heavy in the chest and shoulders, with a reddish face that might have been from cold or from drink or from a general belligerence that had become permanent. He had a way of sitting his horse that suggested he expected whatever he was looking at to give way. He looked at Maeve with mild, assessing surprise, like a man recalculating something. Keene around, he said. Not at present, she said. She had the axe in her hand and made no particular movement to set it down. Can I help you? He looked at the axe and then at her. You must be the new hire, he said. I must be. He shifted in the saddle. Pratt, I own the east parcel. I know who you are, Mr. Pratt. He seemed faintly pleased by this, and also faintly unsure what to do with a woman standing in a yard holding an axe and not being deferential about it. I've got a matter to discuss with Keene regarding the east fence line. Some of his cattle have been coming through. I'll let him know you called, Maeve said. I'd rather speak to him directly. I'm sure you would. She set the axe down against the splitting block and straightened up. He'll be back before dark. You're welcome to wait if you like, though I can't offer you much in the way of comfort. Pratt looked at the house. He looked at the yard. He looked at Maeve again with an expression that was doing some complex internal calculation. The cattle situation needs addressing, he said. It's the second time. I'm not a patient man. Noted, she said. Keene's got a habit of letting things slide. She looked at him evenly. Keene's been through a hard year. You probably know that. I know it, Pratt said. Doesn't solve my fence problem. No, she agreed. It doesn't. I'll make sure he knows you came. Pratt held his horse for another moment, apparently deciding whether he had more to say. He didn't find anything more worth saying. He turned the horse and rode back down the track. Maeve stood and watched him go and thought about fences and how they were both literal and not. When Rowan came in that evening, she told him about Pratt at the table, straightforwardly, while she was putting food out. She didn't editorialize. She just told him what Pratt had said about the cattle and the fence. Rowan's jaw tightened. How many times did he say? Second time, he was quiet for a moment. That fence is... There's a section down on the northeast corner. I knew about it. Okay, she said. He looked up. I'll handle it. I know you will. He watched her for a moment. Did he give you trouble? No, she said. He was perfectly civil. He's not always civil. He was today. She set the last dish on the table. Eli, Clara, come eat. She heard the children's feet on the stairs, and she moved back to the kitchen for the biscuits. And by the time she turned around, Rowan had already sat down and poured the water, and she noticed that he'd poured hers too, not just his own, which was something he hadn't done 3 weeks ago. Small things. She paid attention to small things. He rode out to the northeast fence the next morning before breakfast, which meant he rode out in the dark. And he came back with his hands torn up from the wire and fixed himself without asking for help or acknowledging that it had happened. She put the iodine on the table without comment, and he used it without comment, and that was that. But the fence got fixed. It was in the 3rd week of November that the cold reached the level that changed things inside the house. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that sustained cold changes things. It drove everyone inside and kept them there. And being kept inside together for long periods of time either broke people apart or pushed them into a kind of involuntary intimacy that was its own thing entirely. The evenings became a shared thing. After dinner, rather than Rowan retreating to the front room with the ledger and the children going upstairs and Maeve finishing alone in the kitchen, they started ending up in the same place, the kitchen, which was warmest, with the stove running and the yellow curtains blocking the dark. Clara had taken to sitting at the kitchen table with her schoolwork after dinner, which Maeve had reinstated with a seriousness that Clara had responded to better than expected. Eli read, or pretended to, or worked on a piece of leather he was attempting to repair for one of the horse's bridles. Rowan would come in eventually, at first for coffee, then for coffee and to look at whatever Eli was doing, then for coffee and conversation that started as practical and sometimes became less so. It was in one of these evenings that Maeve learned about Martha. Not from Rowan, from Clara. Clara had finished her arithmetic and was sitting with her chin in her hand, looking at the curtains in the particular way children look at things they're not really seeing, when she said, Mama made those in the 2nd summer. She said she found the yellow at Marsh's and she couldn't leave it there. Maeve was mending a tear in Eli's work coat. She didn't stop or look up. That sounds like something a person does when they find exactly the right color. She liked yellow, Claire said. She said it was the color of something that hadn't given up. Eli looked up from his leather work briefly and then back down. She sounds like a practical woman, Maeve said. She was. Clara traced a finger along the edge of the table. She used to tell me that being brave didn't mean you weren't scared. It meant you did the thing even when you were. Maeve kept her needle moving. She was right about that. Were you scared to come here? The question landed plainly, the way children's questions do when they haven't learned to wrap things up yet. Maeve considered it honestly. I was nervous, she said. That's close to the same thing. Of Papa? Of not being wanted, Maeve said. And because it was Clara asking and Clara was 8 and direct, she added, that's a harder feeling than scared sometimes. Clara thought about this. Papa didn't want you to come, she said. He didn't, at first. But you stayed. I stayed. Clara looked at the curtains again. Mama would have liked you, she said. It was not a consolation. She said it matter-of-factly, like a judgment she'd made and was comfortable with. Maeve looked at her briefly. I'm glad to hear it. She wasn't sure she'd earned that. She wasn't sure you could earn a statement like that, or that it was even about earning. It landed the way it landed, and she let it. Rowan, she realized, was in the doorway. She didn't know how long he'd been there. Long enough to have heard Clara's last few lines, probably. He had his coffee cup, and he was looking at his daughter with an expression that she'd never seen on him before. Not the flattened, careful blankness, not the hard jaw-closed look, but something open and slightly undone. The look of a man watching something he loves go on without him, and realizing that it has been going on, that it didn't stop, that life kept moving even when he stepped out of it, He came in and sat down at the table. "Show me your arithmetic," he said to Clara. Clara produced her slate. He looked at it. He found 2 errors and showed her both of them with more patience than she'd expected, and she argued about the second one with the confidence of a child who is only sometimes wrong, and he demonstrated it twice before she conceded. Maeve mended the coat. Eli fixed the bridle. The stove ran. The night of the fire came on a Saturday. It came the way bad things come when you've been watching for them, in the moment you stopped watching quite as closely. Maeve had been managing the kitchen stove carefully since she'd identified the crack in the pipe joint, keeping the damper slightly lower than she might have otherwise, cracking the window when the fire ran hottest. But Saturday was the coldest day they'd had yet, and she'd been baking, bread and a pot of beans and a small quantity of ginger biscuits she'd made, because Clara had mentioned once that her mother used to make them, and Maeve had found the ginger in the back of the pantry. The stove had been running hard for 3 hours. She smelled it before she saw it. Not smoke exactly, something like the smell of metal getting too hot, a dry, mineral smell that is its own warning if you know what you're smelling. She turned from the bread she was checking. The pipe joint was weeping a thin thread of smoke from the crack. Not a gush, just a thread, the way a wound shows the first sign before it opens. But above the joint, where the pipe met the ceiling collar, the plaster around the edge had gone dark, and she could see the ceiling boards above beginning to stain in a way that meant heat was moving where heat shouldn't be. "Rowan," she said. She said it at a normal volume. She was not a woman who screamed. He was in the front room and he heard the quality of it and was in the kitchen doorway in under 10 seconds. She pointed up. He saw it. His face changed. "Get the children out." "Go for the roof access," she said. "The hatch in the upstairs hall. There's snow up there if you—" "I know my own house, Maeve. Get the children." She went. Clara was in her room. Eli was in his. She went to Clara first, opened the door, said calmly and clearly, "I need you to put your coat on and go to the barn. Now. Don't stop for anything else." Clara looked at her face and moved without argument, which told Maeve something about how she'd delivered it. Eli was already on the stairs when she came out of Clara's room. He'd smelled something, or heard something, or simply had the instincts of a boy who'd been the first responder too many times. "Fire?" he said. "Small," Maeve said. "Go with your sister." "Papa, he's handling it. Go." He went. She went back to the kitchen. The pipe joint had opened further. The thread had become a seam, and the seam had found something in the wall cavity to feed on. Insulation, old wood, something. And the smoke was coming into the kitchen now in a visible, acrid curtain along the ceiling. She heard Rowan on the roof, the hatch opening, footsteps, and then the sound she'd hoped for. Snow being moved, scraped, the wet hiss of it hitting something hot. But the pipe joint itself, the crack she'd been watching for 6 weeks, had separated at the seam. She looked at it. The smoke was coming into the kitchen now with intent. She pulled her apron off and held it over her mouth and looked at the joint and understood what needed to happen. The pipe section needed to come apart so the burning material inside could be managed. She needed to rotate the lower section away from the wall to expose the joint. It was a two-handed job, and the pipe was running at a temperature that was going to make it clear it objected. She found the pot holders, 2 of them, thick, the kind Martha had clearly chosen for actual use rather than appearance, and she gripped the lower section of the pipe. The heat came through the cloth immediately. Not unbearable, not immediately, but she could feel it in her palms, the kind of heat that is politely warning you before it stops being polite. She turned the section. It moved. She kept turning. The seam opened and a gust of hot ash came out, and she turned her face away and kept her hands on the pipe, and kept turning, and the section came clear, and she dropped it to the stone hearth where it could do nothing. And the broken join was open now, and she could see into the damaged section, and she could see that the fire in the wall cavity was small. A smolder, not a blaze, the kind of thing that had ambition but hadn't committed yet. Rowan came through the back door with snow on his coat and saw the pipe on the hearth and Maeve standing at the stove with her hands at her sides. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and looked into the open pipe collar and then up at the ceiling. He went to the wall and put his hand flat on it, feeling for heat. He moved along the wall. He found the spot and grabbed the fire poker and went through the wall at the baseboard, just punched the poker through the old plaster, and worked a section loose. Behind it, The insulation was smoldering in a fist-sized area, and he got his hand in and scooped it out, trailing smoke, and dropped it in this wash basin and poured the water pitcher over it and stood breathing hard. The kitchen was very quiet. Smoke drifted in layers near the ceiling. The stove sat dormant with its pipe disconnected. The hole in the wall was a ragged, dark gap at the baseboard. The bread she'd been making was almost certainly ruined. Rowan turned around. He looked at Maeve. He looked at her hands, which she'd been holding at her sides in the particular way of a person who has done something that has caught up with them. "Let me see," he said. "It's fine. Maeve." He said it like there was no argument in the room, like he was simply stating a fact that she hadn't heard yet. He crossed to her and reached for her hands. She let him look. The palms were red and beginning to blister at the base of both thumbs and across the inner fingers of the right hand where the pipe had been hottest. Not severe, not charred, but real and serious, and getting worse now that the adrenaline was starting to clear. He held her hands in his for a moment. Just held them, looking at the burns, and she looked at the top of his head as he bent over them, at the gray coming in at his temples that she'd noticed before, but not quite like this. "I saw the pipe," she said. "I should have pushed you harder about it." "You pushed me," he said. "I didn't move fast enough." "I didn't move fast enough," he said again, quietly, and there was something in the way he said it that wasn't just about the pipe. She understood that and said nothing. He went for the iodine and the clean cloth, and he wrapped her hands himself carefully, with the unexpected care of a man who must have done this before, for children, or for a wife, or for himself. And she sat at the kitchen table and let him. The children came in from the barn while he was finishing. Eli saw the hole in the wall and the smoke haze and the pipe on the hearth and did a fast, comprehensive assessment that aged him about 5 years and 3 seconds. Clara saw Maeve's wrapped hands. "Are you hurt?" Clara said. She was still in her coat, her face serious and white. "I'm all right," Maeve said. "Your hands, they'll heal." She met Clara's eyes. "Everything's all right. Your father got it." Clara looked at Rowan, who was standing at the wash basin cleaning the iodine off his own fingers. Eli went to the wall and crouched and looked at the hole at the baseboard with the critical eye of a boy already calculating what the repair would take. "We'll need new plaster," Eli said. "I know," Rowan said, "and a new pipe section." "I know that too. I can get the dimensions off the old section if—" "Eli." Rowan looked at his son. There was something careful in his voice and something else underneath it. "Thank you, I've got it." Eli stood up and nodded. Clara moved to the table and sat next to Maeve and put her small hand over Maeve's wrapped one, very lightly, the way a person touches something they're being careful of. Maeve looked at that small hand on hers. She had kept quiet about what it cost her to be here. She'd kept quiet about the 3 weeks of travel, the look on Rowan Keene's face when he first saw her, the women in Dunmore who'd counted her days before she'd finished unpacking. She'd kept quiet about the particular loneliness of being in a house where you're tolerated before you're welcomed, about the weight of being useful in a place where usefulness was the only currency she'd shown up with. She kept quiet about all of that now, too. She just sat at the kitchen table with Clara's hand on hers, and the smell of smoke in the air, and the hole in the wall, and the ruined bread, and the winter pressing at every window, and she was still there, and the house was still standing, and that was the whole of what needed to be true right now. Rowan, at the far side of the kitchen, had not moved. He was looking at her across the room with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet. Not the measuring look or the closed-off look or even the briefly open look from the barn floor in the dark. This was something she didn't quite have a name for, like a man who has been standing at a distance and has finally stopped pretending the distance is what he chose. He looked at her wrapped hands. He looked at Clara's hand over hers. He looked away first, but it took him longer than it would have 2 months ago. Her hands healed slowly, the way burns do. Not cleanly, not linearly, but in fits, better one morning and angrier the next. The skin pulling tight across her palms when the temperature dropped and loosening slightly when the kitchen was warm. She didn't complain about it. She adjusted her grip on things and kept working because the work didn't stop for burned hands any more than it stopped for anything else. Rowan watched her the way a man watches something he doesn't know how to address directly. She caught it. The glance toward her hands when she lifted something heavy, the slight tension in his jaw when she reached across the stove. He didn't offer to take things from her. She wouldn't have wanted him to. and he seemed to understand that. But he started showing up in the kitchen at times that coincided with the heavier tasks. Just appearing, lifting the water pot before she could, bringing the wood in without being asked. He didn't say anything about it. She didn't say anything about it either. What she did notice was that he'd fixed the pipe within 2 days of the fire. He'd ridden into Dunmore himself, come back with the new section and a bag of plaster, and had the whole thing repaired before dinner. He'd also gone along the entire stovepipe and chimney length with a lantern, checking every joint, which was the thing she'd wanted him to do 6 weeks ago and hadn't been able to make happen. She noted it without satisfaction. There was no satisfaction in being right about a thing that had resulted in burned hands and a hole in the kitchen wall. The letter came on a Tuesday. She knew it was a letter because Eli brought it from the mailbox at the end of the track, which he'd taken over as his task in the mornings, partly for the walk and partly because he liked being the one who knew what was coming before anyone else. He brought it to Rowan at the breakfast table, and Rowan looked at the return address on the envelope, and something in his expression flattened in a way that Maeve noticed. He put the letter in his coat pocket and didn't open it at the table. He didn't open it that morning. She watched him carry it through the day the way men carry difficult things, present but untouched, waiting for the right amount of private space to deal with it. He went out to the cattle in the afternoon and came back at dusk and still hadn't opened it. After dinner, when the children had gone up and she was finishing in the kitchen, he came in and sat at the table. She heard him open the envelope, heard the paper unfold. She didn't look over. After a while, he said, "It's from my brother." She waited. "In Missouri." He set the letter on the table. "He writes every few months. He's been writing since Martha died." He paused. "He thinks I should sell." She turned from the basin. Rowan was looking at the letter with the expression of someone reading a thing they already knew was coming. "He thinks the ranch isn't viable, that I should take the children and come back east." He looked up. "He's not wrong that it's been hard." "He's not here," Maeve said. "No." He looked at the letter again. "He's never been here. He came once when we first bought the property, stayed 4 days and said he didn't understand how anyone could live this far from everything." "What did you say?" The corner of Rowan's mouth moved. "I said everything was here." Martha laughed. He folded the letter. She laughed, and he didn't understand why she was laughing, and I did, and that was about all that needed to be said. Maeve dried her hands, carefully, still careful with the palms, and sat down at the table across from him. She'd never done that before, simply sat down across from him without a task to perform or a piece of information to deliver. He looked faintly surprised by it, which told her something about how they'd structured things between them. "Are you going to?" she said. "Consider it?" He looked at the folded letter in his hands. "I've considered it," he said. "In September. In October." He set the letter on the table and left it there. "I'm not going. This is Martha's ranch. It's the children's ranch." His voice was even. "I'm not selling it because I had a hard year." "You had more than a hard year," Maeve said. "I know what I had." He met her eyes. The flatness was still there in his voice, but it wasn't the same flatness as before, not the emptied-out kind, the kind that comes from not having anything left to feel with. This was the flatness of someone making a decision from a place below where words live. "I'm not going." She nodded. He looked at her hands. "How are they today?" "Better," she said, which was mostly true. "You should have called me," he said, "about the pipe before it got to that." "I called you when I saw the smoke." "I mean before, when you first identified the crack." He wasn't angry. His voice was too tired for anger and too honest. "You mentioned it once, and then you just managed around it for 6 weeks. You had a lot to manage." "That's not an answer." She looked at him. He was right, and she knew it, and the honest answer was complicated. She'd managed around it because she'd been managing around things her whole life, because she'd learned early that you don't push in spaces where you haven't been given the right to push, because she'd been in this house as a tolerated presence long enough that she'd calibrated her authority accordingly. But that calibration had put her in front of a hot pipe with potholders on a Saturday, so perhaps it needed adjusting. "I didn't think I had standing to keep pushing on it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You live here," he said. "You work here. He stopped and started again. "You've been holding this house up since October. You have standing. She looked at the table. The word here was doing work in what he'd said. You live here. And she wasn't sure if he'd chosen it deliberately or if it had just arrived that way. Rowan, she said. What? Your brother's letter? She looked at him. It's not just about the ranch, is it? He's asking because he's worried about you, not just the property. He held her gaze for a moment. He doesn't need to be worried. He probably disagrees. He probably does. He picked up the letter and turned it in his hands. He lost his wife too, 8 years ago. He went back to his family and remarried inside the year. He said it without judgment, like someone noting a fact about weather in a different country. That's his way. That's not my way. What is your way? She asked. He looked at the letter, then at her, then at the window where the dark outside was complete, the glass throwing back the lamp's reflection and their two shapes sitting at the table. Stubborn, he said. Martha used to say I was too stubborn to let go of anything worth keeping. She sounds like she was usually right, Maeve said. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite not one. He got up and put the letter on the shelf by the front room door where he put things he dealt with. He poured himself a second cup of coffee and stood with it by the stove and looked at the new pipe section, which was solid and properly fitted and showed no signs of anything wrong with it. It's a good repair, Maeve said. Don't patronize me, he said, but he said it without heat. I wasn't, she said. It is. He drank his coffee. She stayed at the table. The lamp burned between them, and the night pressed at the window, and the house made its familiar sounds. The third stair, the northwest wall when the wind shifted, the small creak of the kitchen floor near the basin that she'd learned to step around so as not to wake anyone at night. I don't know what to do with you, he said. He said it at the window, not quite to her, in the way a person says the thing they've been thinking for a long time when they stop working at not saying it. She didn't answer immediately. You don't need to do anything with me, she said. I'm not a problem to be solved. He turned around. I didn't mean it like that. I know you didn't. She looked at him steadily. I know what you meant. The silence between them was different from the early silences. Not the silence of two people being careful not to aggravate each other, but the silence of two people standing near something they could approach or not approach, and both of them knowing it. He went to bed. She stayed at the table a while longer, listening to the house settle, and then she went to bed too. The crisis, when it came, arrived not from the ranch itself, but from inside her. It came on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after the fire, 7 weeks after her arrival. She woke before 5 as usual and lay in the gray dark of the spare room, her room, and found that she could not, for the first time, make herself get up. Not physically. Her body was willing enough, tired but functional. What wouldn't move was something less locatable than that. She lay there and looked at the ceiling and thought about what it had cost her to be here. She thought about the women in Dunmore counting her days. She thought about Rowan Keene's face when he'd first seen her. This is what they sent. And how that face had changed, and how the changing of it had cost her things she hadn't calculated in advance. Because you never calculate the cost of becoming necessary to people until the necessity is established, and then you realize you've gone somewhere you can't come back from without damage. She had not planned to care about this family. That was not something she'd have admitted out loud, and it wasn't entirely true. She'd cared from the first night, from the moment she saw Clara's face and the way the child had looked at the corn cakes like they were something remarkable. She'd cared from Eli's careful instructions about Fig. She'd cared from Rowan's voice on the barn floor telling her about a woman who died while he was 200 yards away. But caring about people in a place where you're employed is one kind of thing. Caring about people in a place that has become, what? Not home, not quite, but something adjacent to it, something that functions like it. That was another kind. And the question that she lay with in the gray pre-dawn was, when the agency sent another letter, when the arrangement reached its natural end, when Rowan Keene decided that the ranch was stable enough to manage without extra help, what then? She had nowhere else that was more real than this. That was the truth of it, lying flat and still in the cold room. Her trunk was here. Her mornings were here. Her understanding of how the stove behaved and which horse needed what, and how to read Eli's silences and what it meant when Clara sang to herself in the kitchen, all of it was here, and she had built it all, and the question of who it belonged to was one she'd been avoiding because the answer was complicated. She got up. She got up because she had always gotten up, because the fire needed building and the coffee needed starting, and Clara and Eli needed breakfast before their lessons, and the fact that she felt like lying still was not sufficient reason to do it. She had felt worse things on harder mornings, and she had gotten up from all of them. She was at the stove when Rowan came down. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, which he still did sometimes, the old habit of assessing the room before entering it. He looked at her for a moment. "You're quiet," he said. "It's 5 a.m. "You're quieter than usual." He came in and reached past her for the coffee and poured it himself, which he'd started doing as a matter of course. "Did you sleep?" "Enough." He leaned against the counter and drank his coffee, and she felt him looking at her the way she sometimes looked at the stovepipe, checking for something he didn't want to find. "Maeve." "I'm fine, Rowan." "I didn't say you weren't." He put his cup down. "I've been thinking about what you said, about not having standing to push on things." She kept her eyes on the stove. "I want to correct that," he said. "If I've made you feel like your authority in this house has limits, that's my failure, not a fact." She turned around. He was looking at her with the particular directness that had been building in him for weeks. Less and less of the closed look, more and more of something underneath it that was harder to manage, but more honest. He had shaved recently, she noticed. His coat had the missing button replaced, which Clara had done. She'd seen Clara do it 3 days ago without being asked. "You don't owe me that," she said. "I know I don't owe it to you," he said. "I'm saying it anyway." She looked at him. The kitchen was warm. The stove was behaving. The coffee was made and the light was coming up outside in that slow, grudging way that winter mornings came up in this country. "The agency will want a report," she said. "End of November." He was quiet. "They'll ask if the arrangement is continuing," she said. "That's a question you'll need to answer." "I know." "I'm not asking you to answer it right now," she said. "I'm just telling you it's coming." He picked up his coffee again. "What do you want the answer to be?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "I want to stay," she said. It came out simpler and more direct than she'd intended, and she didn't try to take it back or dress it up. "I'm not saying that to make your decision for you. I'm saying it because you asked, and I won't lie about it." He nodded slowly. Not a decision, not a commitment, just an acknowledgement that he'd heard her. She turned back to the stove. The moment that broke something open between them happened not in a conversation but in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, the way the important moments usually do. She was in the yard splitting the last of the kindling. Her hands had healed enough that she could manage the axe again, though she was careful with her grip. The sky was low and white, the kind of white that meant more snow before dark. The ranch was quiet in the particular way it got quiet on cold afternoons when the animals had settled and the work was in a between state. She heard the sound from the barn. It was Clara's voice, and then a crash, and Clara's voice again, higher and less controlled. She dropped the axe and crossed the yard. Clara was in Pearl's stall. She'd apparently been climbing on the stall rail. Maeve had told her twice not to do this, and she'd fallen into the stall. And Pearl, who was a patient and generally mild-tempered animal but was still a cow and had been startled, had stepped sideways, and Clara was against the stall wall with Pearl's considerable bulk between her and the gate, and she was trying not to show how frightened she was, which meant she was very frightened. "Don't move," Maeve said. She was already at the stall gate. "I'm not moving," Clara said, in a very small, controlled voice. "Good. Keep doing that." Maeve unlatched the gate and came in, moving slowly, keeping her body between Pearl and the gate. She put a hand on Pearl's neck and moved her the way you move a large animal that doesn't mean any harm but needs to be redirected. Pressure and patience and the right angle of approach. Pearl shifted. The space opened. Clara slid along the wall and through the gate, and Maeve followed her out and latched it behind her. Clara stood in the barn aisle. Her lip was trembling. "I know," Maeve said, before Clara could start explaining or apologizing. "I just wanted to pet her. I know." She crouched down to Clara's level, which hurt her knees, and looked at the girl's face. "Are you hurt?" Clara shook her head. "Are you sure?" A nod. And then Clara's face did the thing it had been working not to do, and she leaned forward and put her face against Maeve's shoulder. Maeve put her arms around her. Not dramatically, just held her. The way you hold a child who needed holding and knows it and finally let herself have it. Clara cried for about a minute, the brief, hard cry of someone who'd been frightened and is releasing it now that the frightening part is over. Then she pulled back and wiped her eyes with her sleeve and looked at the middle distance with the composure of a child who has decided she's done crying. "I won't climb on the rail again," she said. "That's probably wise," Maeve said. "Don't tell Eli." "Eli would never let you forget it," Maeve agreed. Clara's mouth curved. Then she looked at Maeve with a directness that her face sometimes got, particularly direct for an 8-year-old. "You're going to stay, aren't you?" she said. "For real. Not just until the end of the month." Maeve sat back on her heels. "I'm planning to," she said. And because it was Clara, and Clara deserved honesty even when honesty was imprecise. "Some of that's up to your father." "Papa wants you to stay," Clara said. "Did he say that?" "He doesn't say things," Clara said. "But I can tell." She said it with the calm authority of a child who has been studying the adults in her life with great attention and drawing her own conclusions. "He comes in from the barn earlier now. He didn't used to come in until after dark." Maeve looked at her. "When did you notice that?" "About 3 weeks ago." Clara looked at Pearl placidly eating hay, the whole incident apparently closed from Pearl's perspective. "And he fixed the step, the third one, the one that made noise." Clara looked back at Maeve. "He always said he'd fix it, and he didn't for a long time. He fixed it on Sunday." Maeve said nothing. She had noticed the step, actually, had crossed it on Monday morning in the dark, and realized the creak was gone and stood there for a moment, surprised by its absence. She hadn't known what to make of it. She thought she might know now. That evening, Rowan came in from the eastern pasture later than usual, just at the edge of dark. He came in and hung his coat, and looked at Claire at the kitchen table, and then at Maeve at the stove with the question that parents carry in their eyes when they've been away from their children for a portion of the day. That ongoing, low-level accounting of is everything all right? "Fine," Maeve said before he could ask. He looked at her briefly. Something passed through his expression that she didn't quite catch. After dinner, after the children were in bed, she was putting things in order in the kitchen when he came back in. He stood in the doorway, and she waited. "The agency letter," he said. "I'll write them this week." She kept her hands on what they were doing. "I'll tell them the arrangement is continuing," he said. "Indefinitely, if that suits you." She turned around. He was standing in the doorway with his arms not quite crossed, that old closed posture he'd mostly stopped. And his expression was not easy or comfortable, because this was a man who had not been easy or comfortable in months and didn't get there overnight. But he was there, looking at her directly, saying the thing. "And if at some point you want different terms," he said, "then we discuss terms." She looked at him for a moment. "What kind of terms?" He held her gaze. "The kind that would need to be discussed," he said. She understood what he meant. He wasn't saying it plainly because he wasn't there yet. Not quite. Not all the way. There were still walls with most of their bricks intact. But he was at the wall, which was different from where he'd been 2 months ago, when he'd been on the other side of it, with his back turned. "All right," she said. He nodded. He didn't move immediately. "The third stair," she said. He blinked. "Clara mentioned you fixed it," she said. Something crossed his face. Not quite embarrassment, but near enough. "It needed doing," he said. "It did," she agreed. He left the doorway and she heard him go up the stairs. She listened to his footfall cross the landing, the bedroom door close. She stood in the kitchen with her healed hands and the good stovepipe and the yellow curtains and the lingering smell of dinner and thought about what indefinitely meant. It meant she was staying. Not because the arrangement had been formalized or the terms had been named or anything between them had been resolved. Most of it hadn't, and she was realistic about that, and realistic about what it would take and how long and how imperfect the whole thing would be if it went anywhere at all. But she was staying. She had made that decision on her own, long before he said anything, in the gray pre-dawn of a Wednesday morning when she'd lain still for too long, and asked herself whether she was willing to bear the cost of this place. She'd gotten up and built the fire, and the answer had been in the getting up. The agency letter could say whatever it needed to say. She was staying because she had decided to stay. The rest of it, Rowan and his careful words and his repaired stare and the distance still to go between them, the rest of it could move at whatever pace it moved at. She had not come all this way to be in a hurry about anything. She turned off the lamp. She went up the stairs, stepping over the place where the third one had been, the creek that was gone now, the small fixed thing in the dark that nobody talked about but everybody noticed. She went to bed. Outside, the snow that had been threatening all day finally arrived, soft and without drama, covering the yard and the barn roof and the frozen paddock and the long, flat country stretching out in every direction. It covered the ruts in the track and the gap in the northeast fence, and the timber Vance's men had already started on up at the north edge. It covered the ranch in a quiet that was different from the quiet of neglect. Not the silence of things failing, but the silence of things pausing, settling, waiting for what came next. Doesn't it? The snow that came in the night stayed, not dramatically. It wasn't a blizzard, wasn't the kind of storm that closes roads and downs fences and kills livestock caught in the open. It was just enough snow to change the look of everything, to soften the edges of the yard and the barn roof and the flat country running out to the horizon, and to make the Keene Ranch look in the early morning light like a place that had been waiting for exactly this. A clean layer over the hard months, not erasing them, just covering them enough to let the eye rest. Maeve was up before the snow had finished. She built the kitchen fire, put the coffee on, and stood at the window for a moment looking at the yard. Fig and the roan and copper had come to the paddock fence and stood there in a line with their breath steaming, watching the house the way horses watch houses when they expect something to happen. Pearl's pen was quiet. The hogs were huddled together in the corner of their enclosure. The barn sat solid against the white sky. Its repaired door latched properly. No swing in it. She put her coat on and went out to break the ice on the water trough. Eli was right behind her. She heard the back door, and then his boots, and he appeared beside her with the ice mallet before she'd gotten her hands fully into position. "I've got it," he said. She stepped back and let him. He broke the ice with the efficiency of a boy who had done it enough times that it was no longer a task, but a motion. 4 strikes, clean and economical, the ice pieces pushed to the side. He did the paddock trough, and then went to the barn without being directed, and she heard him start on the feeding. She went back inside. Rowan was at the table when she came in, which was where he was most mornings now. He had his coffee and the ledger open, but he wasn't looking at the ledger. He was looking at the window, at the white yard outside. "Snow's light," he said. "It'll hold the pasture a few more weeks." "Good for the cattle," she said. "Good for the hay supply." He turned a page in the ledger. "Vance's men started on the timber yesterday. Should have the payment by end of month." She poured her coffee and sat across from him. He glanced up at her and then back at the ledger, and the glancing up was ordinary now, unmarked, the kind of thing that happens between people who share a table every morning and have stopped needing to justify the sharing. "I want to talk about the spring sale," she said. He looked up. 14 head, she said. "If the market holds and the cattle come through winter well, what are you looking at?" He named a figure. She thought about it. "Against the note coming due and what you still owe Marsh?" "Leave something," he said. "Not a lot. Enough to get through to summer. And if you get a fair price instead of a market price." He put his pen down. "You're going to suggest I talk to someone. I'm going to suggest you talk to Harlan Briggs." She'd heard the name from Denny Marsh on her last trip to Dunmore, a cattle broker out of Mill Haven, 40 miles north, with a reputation for connecting ranchers to buyers who weren't the standard market. "Marsh says he got Colton's ranch a better deal than the fall auction by 15%. Rowan looked at the window. "I know who Harlan Briggs is." "And?" "And we've never had dealings." "That's not a reason not to." He was quiet for a moment, doing the arithmetic he did, the private, slightly stubborn arithmetic of a man who has managed things his own way for a long time and has mixed feelings about adjusting. She'd learned to let this run its course. Pushing it only made the resistance stiffen. "I'll think about it," he said, which meant yes. She'd learned that too. Clara came downstairs still in her nightclothes and stopped in the kitchen doorway to look at the yard out the window with the uninhibited delight of a child seeing snow. "It snowed," she announced to the room and everyone in it. "It did," Rowan said. "Can I go out?" "Get dressed first." She was back down in 4 minutes, coat misbuttoned, scarf trailing, boots on the wrong feet. Neither Rowan nor Maeve said anything about the boots. She went out the back door, and they heard her voice, and then Eli's voice, lower and less enthusiastic, and then both of them. Rowan listened to this with his coffee cup held in both hands, and something in his face that was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory. "She needs a proper winter coat," Maeve said. "The one she has is last year's." "I know." He set the cup down. "I'll get to Dunmore this week." "I can go." "I'll go," he said. He said it in a way that was clear without being emphatic. He wanted to do it, wanted to be the one who bought his daughter's coat, and she understood that and let it sit where he'd put it. It was December now. 7 weeks since she'd arrived with her trunk in Dell's wagon. The anniversary of it, of sorts, had passed without marking, and she'd thought about it briefly and then not thought about it again. What was there to mark? The woman who'd arrived was more or less the same woman who was here now. A little more tired, maybe. More certain about some things, less certain about others. Her hands were healed, but the skin at the base of her right thumb had gone slightly different in texture, would probably stay that way. Some things don't go back to exactly what they were. That was the December the Pratt matter came to a head. Gerald Pratt rode in on a Thursday, same as before, same heavy-shouldered posture on his horse, same reddish face. But this time, Rowan was in the yard. He'd been repairing the hinge on the barn door, finally getting to the list of things. And he straightened when Pratt came through the gate, and the two men looked at each other with the look of men who have a history that isn't hostile but isn't warm. Maeve was at the kitchen window. She could see them, but not hear them, and she deliberately did not go outside. This was Rowan's ground and his fence line, and she understood the difference between what she could handle and what needed to be his. They talked for about 20 minutes. She could read some of it from the body language. Pratt doing most of the talking at first, Rowan listening with his weight back, arms crossed, face neutral. Then Rowan talking, unhurried. At one point, Pratt gestured toward the east pasture. Rowan shook his head once and then said something else, and Pratt listened and then nodded slowly, the nod of a man who has gotten something less than he wanted and has decided it's enough. Pratt left without incident. Rowan came back inside and stood at the basin and washed his hands. "Well?" she said. "He wanted to buy the east pasture," Rowan said. 20 acres. He's been wanting it for 2 years, apparently. "What did you say?" "No." He dried his hands. "I offered to repair the fence line properly and put up a second line of posts on the property boundary, so there's no future confusion about where the cattle are going." He set the cloth down. He agreed. "That's a fair resolution," she said. "It's the obvious resolution," he said. "Should have done it a year ago." He said it without self-flagellation, just plainly, the way he'd started saying things about the past year, not dwelling on them, not avoiding them, just acknowledging them the way you acknowledge a bad stretch of road. "You were on it. You're not on it now. Here's where you are." She'd watched this shift in him over the weeks with the attention she paid to everything here, quietly, without making it a project. Grief doesn't lift like a lid being taken off a pot. It doesn't have a moment. It changes the way winter changes. Not one morning, but over many mornings. The light coming back a little at a time. The temperature doing things it couldn't do a month ago. You don't notice it until you're looking at something you couldn't see before. What she'd watched him slowly become able to do was be present. In the mornings, at the table, with the children. Not perfectly. There were still evenings he went quiet and distant. Still moments when he'd be in a room and also somewhere else entirely, somewhere 8 months back in the east pasture with the fever running in the house. She didn't try to call him back from those moments. She just kept the room warm and waited, and he came back on his own. The thing she had not expected, had not let herself expect, was what happened on the 14th of December. She had been up since before 5, as always, and she'd built the fire and made the coffee, and then because she'd been meaning to and kept not getting to it, she'd gotten the flour and the dried fruit she'd been rationing carefully, and she'd made a proper cake. Not for any particular reason. It wasn't anyone's birthday. There was no occasion. She'd just felt that morning like making something that wasn't strictly necessary, which was itself a sign of something she didn't examine too closely. She had it cooling on the counter when Rowan came down. He stopped, looked at the cake, looked at her. "What's the occasion?" "None," she said. He looked at the cake again. It wasn't elegant. She'd made it in the cast iron, and the top had domed unevenly, and the dried fruit had sunk to one side because that was what dried fruit did regardless of what you did to prevent it. But it was a cake, and it smelled like warm sugar and the faint sweetness of dried apple. "Martha used to make a cake," he said. He said it carefully, the way he said anything about Martha. Not avoiding it, but holding it gently, the way you hold something still a little fragile. Not for occasions, just sometimes, on a Tuesday. On a Tuesday, Maeve said. She said occasions were too much pressure. Better to do a good thing for no reason. He was looking at the cake, not at her. I haven't smelled that since... He stopped. She didn't fill the silence. It's a good smell, he said. He poured his coffee and sat down, and she cut 2 slices and put one in front of him before the children came down, and they ate cake for breakfast on a Tuesday in December, which was not an occasion and was, for that exact reason, everything. Eli came down, saw the cake, looked at Maeve with the expression of a boy recalibrating the morning's expectations upward, and sat down without a word and held out his plate. Clara came down and said, "Cake?" in a voice of pure, uncomplicated joy, and sat next to Rowan and leaned against his arm while she ate, and Rowan put his arm around her. And the kitchen was warm and full and loud, with Clara's ongoing assessment of the cake's qualities and Eli's counterpoints and Rowan's occasional interjections. Maeve ate her slice and listened and didn't say much and thought about Martha Keene, who had made cake on Tuesdays for no reason, and about yellow curtains that meant something hadn't given up, and about the kind of wisdom that sometimes travels from one woman to another without them ever having met. The Dunmore trip came 2 days later. Rowan took the children, both of them, which he hadn't done since September. He hitched Fig himself and brought the wagon around and called up to the children, and Maeve heard the thunder of feet on the stairs, and both of them appeared in their coats. Clara's misbuttoned again, Eli's properly done, and the collar straight in the way of a boy who was paying attention to how he looked now, which was its own small thing. "We'll be back before dark," Rowan said to Maeve. "I know," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "Do you need anything from Marsh?" She handed him the list she'd already made. He looked at it and folded it and put it in his coat pocket. "Papa," Clara said, "can we stop at the bakery? We're getting you a coat. We're not made of money." "I know, I just asked." Eli made a face at Clara from behind Rowan's back that meant obvious, and Clara made a face back that meant, "I know, let me try." Rowan did not see any of this and didn't need to. "We'll see," he said, which was not no. Maeve watched the wagon go down the track. Fig moved at her usual pace. Clara was already talking about something. Eli was sitting straight, watching the road ahead, in the way he sat when he was trying to look older than 11 and almost managing it. She stood in the yard until the wagon was small and then not visible. The ranch was quiet around her, Pearl in her pen. The hogs rooting. The horses in the paddock moving slowly in the cold. The barn with its good hinge and its solid roof. The house behind her with its repaired pipe and its patched wall and its third stair that no longer creaked. She went inside. She cleaned the kitchen properly. Not the daily cleaning, but the thorough kind, moving the furniture, getting into the corners that the daily routine missed. She reorganized the pantry for the 3rd time since she'd arrived, because the 3rd time she was working with enough stock that the organization actually mattered. She checked the remaining firewood against her estimate of what winter still had to deliver and made a note about what they'd need. She was in the front room dusting the shelves when she found the photograph. She hadn't been in the front room often. It was Rowan's domain, where the desk and the ledger lived, and she'd respected it the way you respect the private space of someone you live alongside. She'd been in it, clearly, but she hadn't looked at the shelves properly. The photograph was in a small frame, set back slightly behind the ledger, as though it had been moved rather than placed there. A woman, maybe 35, dark-haired, with a direct way of looking at the camera that suggested she'd been comfortable with herself. She was standing next to Rowan, a younger Rowan, softer around the jaw, unguarded, and she was smiling at something slightly off to the side of the camera, not performing for the lens but caught in a real moment. Martha Keene, clearly. The hair and the cheekbones were Eli's, the eyes were Clara's. Maeve looked at the photograph for a moment, not intrusively, just honestly. She thought about a woman who made cake on Tuesdays, who chose yellow curtains, who stood in a field helping repair fences and made her husband laugh loud enough that it carried to wherever someone was standing and seemed like the whole world from there. She set the frame forward on the shelf so it wasn't hidden. Then she went on with the cleaning. The family came back as the light was going. She heard Fig on the track and then the wagon in the yard and the children's voices. She put water on for the coffee and started dinner. Clara appeared first in the kitchen doorway. in a new coat, dark blue, practical, properly sized, with her old coat over one arm because she hadn't wanted to leave it in the wagon. "He got it," she announced, "and he got Eli new gloves, and—" She looked briefly conspiratorial. "We stopped at the bakery." "Is that right?" Maeve said. "Just one thing each." He was very serious about it. She put her old coat on the hook and smoothed the new one with both hands. "Do you like it?" "It's a good coat," Maeve said. "Dark blue was the right choice." Clara nodded, satisfied. She sat at the kitchen table and watched Maeve at the stove with the comfortable ease of someone who has decided that a kitchen with someone working in it is the correct version of a kitchen. Eli came in, new gloves in hand, and went directly to the barn to see to the horses. Rowan came in last, coat snowy from the ride back, and set Marcia's parcels on the counter. He looked at the front room doorway. She didn't know if he'd seen the photograph yet. She kept working at the stove. After a moment, he went to the front room. She heard him stop. A pause. Longer than a moment. He came back to the kitchen. He didn't say anything about the photograph. He got his coffee and stood near the stove in the way he'd started standing sometimes, not needing to do anything there, just near. "Marsh gave me something for you," he said. She looked up. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small paper-wrapped package. He set it on the counter beside her. She looked at it and then at him. "He said it was on account of your business," Rowan said. "Whatever that means." She opened the paper. Inside was a small tin of good tea, the kind that cost more than cornmeal and that she'd looked at once in the store and put back without purchasing. She looked at it for a moment. "I may have said something to him about it," Rowan said, at the window, not at her. She looked at the back of his head. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. She put the tin on the shelf above the stove where she'd be able to reach it in the mornings. She didn't say anything else about it. She went back to dinner. The evening came down around the ranch the way evenings came. The dark arriving early and completely in December, the temperature dropping fast once the sun was gone, the wind doing its work against the walls. But inside the kitchen was warm and the lamp was lit, and Clara was setting the table with the fork and knife arrangement Maeve had taught her. Fork on the left, knife on the right. The way that had seemed formal to Clara at first, and now was just what you did. Eli came in from the barn and washed his hands at the basin without being reminded. Rowan brought in 2 more logs for the stove before sitting down because he'd noticed 2 days ago that she was being conservative with the wood and had started making sure the stack inside was always adequate before evening. They ate. The conversation was about the bakery item. What it was, whether Clara's choice was superior to Eli's choice, which became a debate with genuine stakes. Rowan sided with Eli's selection on the grounds of practicality, which Clara said wasn't the point of pastry, and Maeve said she thought they were both wrong, and that the correct answer was whatever Denny Marsh's wife made on the 3rd shelf on the right, which nobody had tried and which they should correct at the earliest opportunity. Everyone had an opinion about this. The dinner lasted longer than it needed to. Later, after the children were in bed, she was at the kitchen table writing her monthly account of household expenses, a habit she'd started to give herself a clear picture of what was spent and what was saved. When Rowan came back in from checking on the livestock, he sat down across from her, which he did sometimes now, and poured the last of the coffee and was quiet in the comfortable way, not the loaded way. "Briggs," he said after a while. She looked up. "The cattle broker." He turned the cup in his hands. "I'll write to him. Before Christmas." She nodded and went back to her column of figures. He watched her work for a moment. "Do you know what Marsh said to me today?" he said. "What did he say?" "He said—" He stopped, and something like sheepishness crossed his face, which was not an expression she'd seen on him before and which she found she liked. "He said whoever I'd hired had clearly done the place good. He said the account looked different." He looked at his cup. "He said I looked different." She said nothing. "I told him it was the ranch coming back around," Rowan said. "And he said?" "He said the ranch doesn't hire people." He glanced up briefly and away. "He can be pointed, Marsh." "He seems to know his business," Maeve said. The quiet came back. Outside, the wind moved across the flat land and pushed at the house, and the house held the way it had been holding all winter, all the winters before, the way structures hold when they've been properly tended. She finished her column of figures and the numbers resolved cleanly, which they hadn't in October. She put the pen down. "Rowan," she said. He looked at her. "The photograph," she said. "On the shelf in the front room. I moved it forward. If you'd rather it wasn't there, if you want it somewhere else, or put back." "No," he said. He said it simply, without complication. "Leave it where you put it." She nodded. He looked at the table. She would have... He started and then held it for a moment, the way he held things that cost him. She would have said I was being an idiot about the beginning of all this, about sending you back. Maeve looked at him. She might have. She had no patience for stubbornness that wasn't useful. He said it with something in his voice that was grief and fondness and a kind of clear-eyed love that has survived being broken and still knows what it knows. She would have said, "Take the help when it's offered. Don't stand in your own way." She'd have been right, Maeve said. She usually was. He was quiet. "I wasn't ready in October for any of it. I want you to know I understand that. What I put you through at the start. What I made harder." She looked at him steadily. "You were in the middle of something," she said. "People in the middle of things aren't always at their best." That's a generous way to put it. It's an accurate way to put it. She folded the account paper and set it aside. "I wasn't at my best either. I was scared of not being wanted, and I let that make me quieter than I should have been about some things." He held her gaze. "The stovepipe," he said, "among others." A beat. "We're both better than October," he said. "We are," she said. What happened next happened slowly, which was the only way it could have happened. Not that night, and not in a single moment with a single declaration, because they were both too old and too honest for that kind of thing. What happened was more like the thaw Clara had once described to Maeve, the way she'd heard it described, how after a hard freeze the ground doesn't give way all at once, but warms in layers. The top first, the deep parts last, until eventually the whole thing is moving again, and you wonder how it could have been so solid just a few weeks before. They talked more, not about large things, not at first, about the cattle and the spring sale, and the timber payment, and the hog pen that needed a new post on the east side. But the talking about small things became a container for other things, the way it does between people who have decided, without ceremony, that the other person is worth talking to. He told her about Martha more, not in grief sessions, not in the barn at 2 a.m. over a bottle, but in the ordinary way of someone integrating a loss into the story of their life, rather than keeping it locked in a separate room. Martha had been terrified of the frontier in the first year. She'd come from a city, real city, with paved streets, and she'd hated the mud and the isolation and the way the sky was so big it felt like it was watching you. She turned it around by month 8. By the second year, she was the one who wanted to stay when Rowan started talking about whether they'd made the right choice. She made it hers, Rowan said. Whatever she touched, she made it hers. Maeve thought about that. She told him, in turn, about the years before she'd come here, about the husband she'd had, who had been a good man in most ways, but had not been able to stay still, who had taken them both from place to place until the places ran out, and then, eventually, so had he. About the years after that, the boarding houses, the work that was always available if you were willing and always slightly less than what you needed. About the particular loneliness of being a capable woman in a world that only wanted that capability within very specific limits. He listened to all of it without offering solutions, which was the right thing to do. "Is that why you answered the advertisement?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "Partly," she said, "and partly because I was done living in other people's spaces in the way that doesn't count. I wanted somewhere that counted." He was quiet for a moment. "Does this count?" She looked at the kitchen, the yellow curtains, the repaired wall, the good stovepipe, the tin of tea on the shelf. She looked at the table where the children ate and the ledger sat, and the numbers were finally moving in the right direction. "Yes," she said, "it counts." The letter to the agency went out the following week. Rowan wrote it himself and read it to her before sealing it, which she hadn't expected, and which told her something she didn't need to say out loud. It was formal, as letters to agencies are, but its meaning was clear. The arrangement was permanent, the terms were changing, and the household at the Keene Ranch had no further need of the agency's placement services. She stood at the window the morning Eli took it to the mailbox at the end of the track and watched it go. That was the thing about letters. Once they were sent, they were real. Before the sending, anything could still be otherwise. After, you had committed yourself to the world as you'd named it, and the world would either confirm you or it wouldn't, and you had to live with having said the thing either way. She had said she was staying. She was staying. January came, and February behind it, and the cattle came through winter lean but whole. The letter from Harlan Briggs arrived in early February with a spring buyer already identified, a price 15% above what the fall market would have offered. Rowan read it at the breakfast table and passed it across to Maeve without comment, and she read it and passed it back. And that was their version of celebration. Efficient and private and entirely sufficient. Eli turned 12 in February. He was taller by a visible degree than he'd been in October, or maybe he just stood differently. He'd started teaching Clara to ride properly, not just sitting on a horse, but managing one, and she'd taken to it with the concentrated determination of a child who understands that a skill is a kind of freedom. Maeve watched from the paddock fence while Eli corrected Clara's seat with the seriousness of a professional, and thought about how much of what we become is taught to us by the people who are only a little further along than we are. The morning in March, when Rowan first took her hand, was an ordinary morning in every other respect. They were in the paddock together, checking the roan's near foreleg, which had been slightly tender and bore watching. They were both crouched down, looking at the same thing, and when they both stood up at the same moment, he reached out and steadied her arm because the ground was uneven and her boot had caught. Just a practical thing, a hand on an arm. And then he held on to her hand instead of letting go, and neither of them said anything about it. And they stood there for a moment in the early spring cold with the roan watching them over her shoulder, and the flat country stretching out in every direction. It was not a perfect moment. It was muddy and cold, and they'd both been up since before 5, and her hair was not done, and his coat was missing a button again, and they were standing in a paddock checking a horse's leg. There was nothing about it that matched any version of how people are supposed to tell each other something. But his hand was warm, and hers was, and the truth of the thing didn't need the conditions to be right. The truth of it had been built across months of ordinary mornings and split kindling and dinner tables and yellow curtains and a stair that didn't creak anymore. And it was solid in the way that only ordinary things, accumulated over time, can be solid. "Maeve," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I haven't said anything yet." "I know," she said again. He was quiet for a moment. Then he made the sound that was almost a laugh and looked at the far fence line and shook his head slightly, and his hand stayed where it was. It would not be simple after this. She knew that. He was still a man who went quiet at certain angles of afternoon light, who would sometimes stop in the middle of a task and be somewhere else for a moment. The children would have complicated feelings at complicated times. The ranch would have good years and bad ones. Pratt would probably be difficult again at some point, and the weather would do what weather does, and there would be winters nothing could make easy. None of that was the point. The point was that you didn't wait for simple. You didn't hold out for uncomplicated or easy or without history or without cost. You took the life that was actually in front of you, with the mud still on it and the work still in it and the grief woven through it, and you decided whether it was worth standing in. She had decided that on a Wednesday morning when she couldn't make herself get up and then got up anyway. She was still getting up. The roan snorted and tossed her head and moved away from them toward the hay, done being inspected. Eli's voice carried from the barn, calling something to Clara. The kitchen window showed the lamp still burning inside, the yellow of the curtains visible even at this distance. A house with light in it, a house with people in it who were going to be all right. That was the whole of it, not grand, not delivered without cost, not uncomplicated or clean or arrived at easily. Just true. The way the best things are true. The way things are true when they've been tested and held. When someone has looked at what they could walk away from and decided, plainly and without performance, to stay. She was still there. She was still there, and so was he, and so were the children, and so was the ranch. That was enough. That was, it turned out, exactly enough.